Great. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Cliff Matias, and I am the cultural director of the Redhawk uh, Indigenous Arts Council, and I was asked to present here today for Native American Heritage Month. So it's a really busy month, November. It means absolutely nothing to Indigenous people other than the government picked this month to highlight Native American arts and culture and history and people. But for the most part, to Indigenous people, it's just another month. It's nothing we selected, but it does give us an opportunity to share our culture and traditions with people, and highlight many of our accomplishments. So we haven't embraced it. It's probably November. It was picked, in November, probably because of its proximity to Thanksgiving, and that whole Thanksgiving sort of, myth, you might say, that we as Americans, follow. Unfortunately, most of that is, incorrect. So, it is a challenge for us during Thanksgiving. I mean, a lot of American holidays are a challenge for Native people. But Thanksgiving is probably one of the more difficult ones that we face. So I'll probably start off just with, sharing a little bit about Thanksgiving and then maybe work backwards, a little forwards. Um, you know, um, Here in New York City, well, I'll tell you what, I'll go backwards and we'll get to Thanksgiving. Because, here in New York City, which has one of the largest urban indigenous populations, right, of indigenous people in the country. Often forgotten in that are the immigrant indigenous people that are here, and then the indigenous people who've come to New York and sort of made this place their home, because there are indigenous people from all over the country who reside here. The original Lenape people of Manhattan, the Matahatta, the Sanhegan, most of them, the actual from Manhattan, never really survived the Dutch. The Dutch were pretty ruthless when they arrived here. They wanted the land here in Manhattan, and so the indigenous people were pushed off the land or massacred or even victims of germ warfare. The closest Lenape tribe here in New York City are the Ramapo Lenape, and they're in Mahwah, New Jersey. Then in South Jersey is Nanacoke Lenape. There are Lenape people and descendants, from this area, from New Jersey, who were ventured north and joined the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. So in Canada, there's a reservation called Six Nations where the Lenape, or they call themselves Delaware, they are there, and then also those survivors moved west and became known as the Stockbridge Munsee, and then also the survivors also moved south to Oklahoma. So they're all Lenape in Oklahoma, in Canada, and then right in New Jersey as well. There's also the Scatacoke tribe, which are part Lenape, and they are also in New York and like Kent, New York. So just a little history of some of the Native people here. So the Ramapo Lenape and Chief Dwayne Perry sort of do a lot of the officiating, you might say, here in New York City. I know Chief Perry was just part of the marathon, and so they do a lot of that, of that work. New York City is a challenge for Indigenous people because it hosts the largest Columbus Day parade in the world. And, we've been struggling to get Indigenous Peoples Day not just off the New York calendar, but also off the national calendar. So it's pretty challenging here in New York with Indigenous Peoples Day and New York City hosting the largest Columbus Day parade in the world. But we struggle to get that taken off the calendar. So really sure if it's realistic, here in New York City in the near future, but we keep struggling. So we host a really beautiful Indigenous Peoples Day celebration in Randall's Island. I don't know if any of you have ever been there or seen it, but I'll share some. Let me share a little video with you, and you can let's see. Okay, yeah, this is a little news footage of what we did, and this was this year here in Randall's Island. Let me see if I can get rid of this. I don't hear any sound. Oh, here we go.
Day 2 of this free event here on Randall's Island. Again, open to all. It will begin in just a few hours with a traditional tobacco and water ceremony. Over 2 days, the public is invited to experience Indigenous culture up close, from tasting authentic foods like fry bread and Indian tacos to taking part in traditional drum and dance performances.
So I think it's just a beautiful celebration of global Indigenous heritage and resilience, and also sharing what our shared continued fights are.
This year, organizers are also paying tribute to the late Madonna Brave Bull Allard, known for leading thousands of Indigenous people to protect their lands and water against the Dakota Access Oil Pipeline. Attendees saying the celebrations also foster community.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here because it means that people are willing to come together, to stand together, to learn about what Indigenous really means and how to embody it and embrace it and to live it.
And here in New York and across the country, really, these Indigenous Peoples Day events have grown as an alternative to Christopher Columbus Day events. And again, this will be day 2 of this 2-day event celebration happening here on Randall's Island. Organizers also say it is a way to honor more than 530 years of Indigenous culture, contributions, and also survival. We're live here on Randall's Island. Justin Fitch, Pix 11 News. Vanessa, back inside to you.
Hi, I'm Mr. Mc.
Let me try and share this. Share, okay. Yeah, so that is our Indigenous Peoples Day celebration that we do on Randall's Island. So it's free. So if any of you missed it or looking to attend next year, it happens on the Sunday before what's technically known as Columbus Day. And then it continues the next day. But there is a beautiful sunrise ceremony that happens at 7 a.m. The area chiefs and leaders from the communities all attend, and there's prayer ceremony, and then there's dances and music, as you saw. So, that's our Indigenous Peoples Day celebration. There are Indigenous people from all over the globe that do attend the event. I mentioned that we like to, move up the calendar and discuss some of the issues that affect Indigenous people. And, there's everything from the mascot issue to the holidays. Even, the Halloween Day parade is difficult for Indigenous people when we see people walking, dressed in our regalia or in our dress and sort of mocking Indigenous attire. I think this year was were the really least amount of people I've ever seen really dressed up as a Native person during Halloween. So we are making some headway, and that's really good. But we still have a lot of people walking around, and it's almost the equivalent of blackface for Indigenous people when people are walking around that way. So we know we have a little ways to go, but we hope in the future that people will stop wearing cultural attire in general, right? Because traditions, culture, and religion are not costumes. So we always try to remind people, of that. It is hurtful to Indigenous people and their communities when we see that. I had mentioned a little bit about Thanksgiving and really what that means, for Indigenous people. A few years, it wasn't a few, it was almost in the early 2000s, I think. I don't even remember how long ago it was, but MTV had contacted me and asked me if I would consult on a particular piece that they were doing. And I said, sure. And this piece was part of this Decoded series that they had. And it was sort of re-educating people about history. So I'm going to share it with you. It's really short, but it's kind of interesting. It's a, sort of Thanksgiving story, better than I can tell it. So I'm gonna share this screen with you now, and
For the ones who get it done, the most important part is the one you need now.
sorry.
And the best partner is the one who can deliver. That's why millions of maintenance and repair pros trust Grainger, because we have professional grade supplies for every industry, even hard to find products.
And I'm thankful for my kindergarten class who made these wonderful crafts to celebrate Thanksgiving.
After the Native Americans helped the Pilgrims survive their first winter in America, the Puritans invited them to share the first Thanksgiving.
Oh, these are adorably wrong.
A 5-year-old made that
Based off of the lies that you taught them.
Excuse me?
Oh, it's not your fault. These are full of half-truths and historical propaganda.
I thought the Native Americans and the Pilgrims were like besties or whatever.
At best, the Pilgrims and Wampanoags could be described as political allies. By the time the Pilgrims showed up, not only were 2/3 of the Massachusetts tribes completely wiped out by European slave owners and diseases, the Pilgrims were constantly at war with the Indigenous people and routinely tortured them.
But what about Squanto, the Native American who learned English to help out the Pilgrims?
He was actually a slave that was hauled off to Europe, and then he learned English so that he could escape.
But they did celebrate it every year, right?
Not exactly. The next one was 16 years later, and unfortunately, it was because the Puritans were celebrating the massacre of the Pequot tribe. Back then, Thanksgiving was also for families, specifically murdering them.
Okay, we get it. History is awful. The Puritans were terrible. And now we have to let our children know that the holiday started with tons of killings. Happy?
Well, we actually have just about everything wrong with the Thanksgiving myth. Definitely didn't wear these buffalo hats. Didn't land on Plymouth Rock. And as for that turkey, more like venison, fowl, and eel.
Oh, who cares about how the stupid holiday got started anyway?
Exactly. In George Washington's 1789 Thanksgiving Proclamation, the settlers aren't mentioned not even once. Thanksgiving wasn't celebrated nationwide until 1863 when this guy declared it a national holiday during the Civil War in order to bring the country together. That's why all of our foods are from the 19th century.
So Lincoln came up with the whole Indian Pilgrim story.
Nope, that myth didn't catch on until the 1900s after we had fought and killed all the Native Americans. And then we put it in textbooks as fact. Because America. But the food is really good. And if you ignore all the terrible history, like the murdering, the raping, the pillaging, it's still kind of a great holiday.
So the Mayflower is a lie.
Why do we eat cranberry sauce?
What about stuffing?
Is Black Friday really just a capitalist conspiracy to get poor people to buy things so we can't truly live out a populist revolt?
Or is it
I'm never telling you the truth ever again.
So that's pretty much a better Thanksgiving story than I, could tell you. But do Indigenous people celebrate Thanksgiving? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Indigenous people are very patriotic. They're one of the highest volunteers of per capita. They are the highest volunteers per capita of any people. They've served in every single conflict and battle that this country has ever been in, even before it was formed as a country. We'd all be speaking French if it wasn't for the Iroquois during the French Indian War, who kept France out of New York State. Indigenous people are very patriotic. And many celebrate Thanksgiving with that understanding, because each tribe has dozens of ways of giving thanks. And so, not just one day a year. Even Navajo people, they have a giving thanks ceremony that happens every morning. They just give thanks for the sun coming up in the sky. So giving thanks is a big part of who Indigenous people are. So it's kind of fitting that it fits in. But, as long as we remove that story of Wampanoags and Pilgrims. But in Massachusetts, on that day, the Wampanoag people have a day of mourning, and they fast and remember their ancestors, because the Pilgrims, they did arrive, and they did have a ceremony for their first harvest. It's not what the celebration that we do as Americans, but that did happen. But it only really happened once, because the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags went to war. It lasted for 50 years, which almost completely annihilated the Wampanoags. But they still are alive today. They're in Massachusetts and in Cape Cod. It's the same place, Cape Cod, Massachusetts. But many do fast during Thanksgiving. It is a day of mourning for them. So the Wampanoags also celebrate and come to New York for our Indigenous Peoples Day and help us celebrate there during that event as well. So probably one of the biggest issues that Indigenous people have today, and it's really great that New York State has removed this. So no schools can use Indigenous people as mascots, but there still are plenty of teams that use. There's the Blackhawks and the Chiefs, and there's no more Redskins, but there are the Atlanta Braves. So it is a struggle for Indigenous people to get the country to sort of get on board and remove mascots. Years ago, we tried to get the Redskins removed, and we couldn't. Actually, the Redskins were removed from the calendar, not because of anything that Indigenous people said or did. It was really because of the George Floyd incident that happened here that sort of got the ball rolling for the Redskins to remove and change it to the I think Commanders. But it wasn't from Indigenous Voices. Indigenous Voices really had nothing to do with that, change of sports teams. We still struggle to have those other teams removed. The Congress of American Indians had created a commercial to run during the Super Bowl before. This was like in the early 2000s, I think it was in the early 2000s. The NFL wouldn't play it because they don't play political messages. But it's a really great commercial. I'm going to share it with you real quick. But it does sort of address the Redskins thing. But again, we still have Chiefs and dressing up as Native people and using Indigenous people as mascots. So I'll share it with you real quick. Let's see.
Indian. Sioux, survivor, spiritualist, patriots, Sitting Bull, Hiawatha, and Jim Thorpe. Mother, father, son, daughter, chief, Apache, Pueblo, Choctaw, Chippewa, and Crow. Underserved, struggling, resilient. Squanto, Red Cloud, Tecumseh, and Crazy Horse. Rancher, teacher, doctor, soldier. Seminole, Seneca, Mohawk, and Creek. Will Rogers, Geronimo. Unyielding, strong, indomitable. Native Americans call themselves many things. The one thing they don't.
Hi, Cliff. I'm Catherine Hughes. I'm the director of the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And I just wanted to say that we are exploring the archaeology of our site and looking into the evidence that we have of those who came before white settlement. And finding, some interesting stuff from prior studies that were done, and working with CUNY right now to identify some of the objects that were uncovered and that haven't really been studied. And so they will finally get a chance to be studied through this partnership that we have with CUNY. So we're very excited about that. But I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the New York dimension of Native Americans. There's a great exhibit at the National Museum of the American Indian down in Battery Park on called We Are Still Here, I think. Is that the title of that exhibit?
I'm not familiar with it. I haven't seen it, but
it's really great at sort of saying, like, you think we left, and we're still here. And so many different groups that are still here. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the New York dimension of Native life and how, we have the Lenape Center in Manhattan. We have your work. We have a lot of different people doing stuff. So could you talk a little bit about New York? That perspective.
As I mentioned it earlier, New York does have the largest urban population of indigenous people, and that's not even counting the indigenous immigrant population that's here. There are various organizations doing stuff. I did talk earlier. Were you here when I first went on?
I was a little late to the party.
I
missed something.
I did mention and talk about the Lenape tribes that are here and around the area, the Ramapo Lenape, and I did explain a little bit about the Lenape who moved west. So like the people from the Lenape Center are Oklahoma Lenape people. So they're here in New York City, but they're kind of they don't recognize the Lenape tribes that are here. They don't recognize the Ramapo Lenape, who are state recognized by the state of New Jersey, and also the Nanacoke Lenape in southern New Jersey, who are state recognized.
So yeah, there is a real difference between federal and state recognition, isn't there?
Just to not to indigenous people, but to the government entities and often to the sometimes to the federally recognized natives who might pull that card and say, hey, we're federally recognized. But the fact of the matter is, for the government to say who we are as natives and who we aren't kind of goes against our whole mindset in the first place, right? But the Lenape people, the Ramapo Lenape have never left. I mean, they're still here. They do a lot of things here in the city, like the start of New York City Marathon was hosted by Chief Dwayne Perry from the Ramapo. They started the marathon, so they do a lot of things here. I don't really know too much about the Lenape Center other than there's a couple Lenape from Oklahoma that are there. But for the most part, the indigenous community here in New York City, and the people who've been doing this, I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years. We sort of connect ourselves more to the Lenape tribes that have been here all along, the people we've been working with for over 30 years. The Oklahoma sort of Lenapes who have a distant claim to New York City, sort of over the last like 8 years, so to speak, or less than 10 years, just kind of popped up and said, okay, we're here. But for the indigenous organizations here, we have such a connection and working relationships with the Lenapes from New Jersey, the Ramapo and Nanacoke Lenapes, that's sort of who we've worked with and we continue to work with.
Can you talk a little bit? I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what just even Lenape means.
Well,
a lot of people, because it's the Delaware people or Lenape or Ramapo,
Lenape is
a lot of people that don't understand.
Sure. Lenape is a modern term. So, when the Dutch arrived here, they encountered and heard stories of, before they encountered them, a powerful nation of people that had a confederacy, and there were 5 powerful nations. They were known as the Iroquois. The Mohawks were the tribe that came into New York the most. They'd come down the river, and they were north of Albany, and they'd collect taxes and tribute. The Delaware-speaking bands that lived in the New York area, they were Delaware-speaking. There was no such thing as Lenape. They never called themselves Lenape. They called themselves by the bands that they were. There were Matahatta in Manhattan, Sanhegan, Canarsie, Hackensack, Tappan. These are all bands.
Names that everybody knows, but they don't realize maybe where they come from.
They were all Delaware-speaking people. That was the language that they spoke. They all had dialects. Some of their dialects were, difficult for even them to understand. When they were being removed from their land, they were, they always had, they didn't have good treaties. They wanted to really copy what the Iroquois had done, because they formed a confederacy of powerful nations. So in the late 1600s, they formed this thing called the Lenni Lenape, which was a confederacy of all the surviving Lenape, but it was already too late. They couldn't really keep this thing going and get treaties and trade the way the Iroquois had. And they left this area with that title, as so-called Lenape. But in all reality, Lenape were just different bands of Delaware-speaking people. The Raritan, like I said, the Hackensacks, just many different bands of surviving people that got together and then moved west.
Did that include the Muncie?
I mean, they say the Muncie thing is a little because they say the Muncie were in the northern part of New York State, and not in New Jersey. But it's really difficult to say. I mean, the Dutch didn't keep great records, but the Muncie did sort of encompass some of the Lenape as well. And I believe in Wisconsin they're kind of together. So
Well, I lived in Indiana for quite a few years, and it is a Lenape history that we talk about in the middle of the state.
right,
And it is the Oklahoma band that you're talking about,
right,
that we're referencing. You know, that's really Indianapolis. Just north, it would be Miami. But right in Indianapolis, it would be what was referenced as Lenape or Muncie. And I got to know some people who were involved in trying to share the history of the Lenape as we talked about it there. And what always sort of blew my mind was how many times this group of people were moved across the United States.
right.
So Oklahoma, it's like, they started on the East Coast, and they moved were moved by no choice of their own, all the way to Oklahoma. And so they have the sad, really the sad moniker of being the most moved people.
And as I spoke about before, and some went to Wisconsin, and then another group went up to Canada, and then and joined the Iroquois, and they're still there today. So on the Six Nations Reserve, there's also Delaware people too. So in Ontario, so they say on the journey west that some Lenape hid in the mountains in New Jersey, remain there, and so that's where the name the Ramapo Lenape, and so the state of New Jersey recognizes them, and they have a reservation in Mahwah, New Jersey. So,
oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
just right outside of the city.
Yeah, and there's the Ramapo Mountain Indians. Is one of the names they call themselves. But yeah, their reservation is right in Mahwah.
So what I was curious about, here we are, a historic house museum that sits on a location that was probably pretty important, as the second highest part of Manhattan. It was a prominent point, and so there's sort of little doubt that that spot of land would be used as a lookout area for anybody. I mean, it was used for that purpose by George Washington. So what can we do as a historic house museum that knows, like, we know that we have that history, that we want to recognize that history, we want to be able to honor that history. So can you talk a little bit about what would be helpful by small and large museums in the New York area for Indigenous people?
I'm a little confused on your question.
Well, how could we best recognize that history? Should we, should we have events like a powwow, or would that be completely wrong? That kind of idea, some people jump right to it, but is that the best way?
Well,
So-
you definitely shouldn't be hosting a powwow there. But I mean, you can bring in, indigenous performing groups or artists to share culture or
Mhm.
different things like that, or to talk about. Uh, and again, there are quite a few indigenous speakers and who Lenape can talk about, and even Iroquois too. From the Iroquois people, the Mohawks from upstate New York. They are certainly a part of New York history. They would come into New York all the time and collect taxes from the tribes here, um, uh, and share, and they can share that Eastern Woodlands traditions. But yeah, those are definitely things that you can put together. Um,
that is something that we want to be able to do more of, as we think about part of our strategic plan is that we broaden our narrative, that we look beyond that sort of George Washington story that put us on the map, if you will, of American history. That is a part of our history, but it's not the only part.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's not, I mean,
So I wanted to hop in, just kind of almost in the same vein, but kind of turning it to the Indigenous Arts Council that you're a part of, Cliff, the Redhawk Arts Council. Could you tell us a little bit about how actively having the space for Indigenous art and artists can preserve culture, and sort of a non-material culture that many people don't think of when they think of heritage and history? Maybe it's not the first thing to pop into their brain.
you're asking how I'm confused with your question. How we can
I think if I may, Danielle, are you asking
Go for it.
what the Red Hawk Center is doing
yeah,
to
what we're doing or how we can work? I was confused.
What are you doing? Basically, like.
Oh, okay, sure. I mean, we do, tons of educational programs in schools and universities. Then we host events like, what we showed, the Indigenous Peoples Day event on Randall's Island. And we present programs for schools, universities, other organizations, and even programs like this, Um, uh, we're made up of indigenous artists and presenters from across the hemisphere. So we have Lenape people and Iroquois people, and just a vast variety of historians, speakers, educators.
Danielle, we have a couple of questions.
We do. I was waiting for
Sure.
a little bit of a pause to get into it. So this one, we kind of answered the first part because the first part of the question is, are the Munsey's Lenape, which we talked about just a little while ago. But this attendee would also like to hear your thoughts on how the Indigenous history of New York features in the New York State public school curricula, and if that content is a required part of the educational curriculum, and if it's accurate or not so accurate.
The New York curriculum has recently changed, and they put in Lenape, but it's not none of it is really precise or accurate. They used to teach the Iroquois Confederacy and only go up to 5 nations. So yeah, the native curriculum in New York City is horrible. And I don't know, what they plan to do with it, but they're certainly not. I mean, they don't even teach what I just taught you about, or told you about, that Lenape people are a confederacy. They, so the Lenape people are like, people leave there and thinking that Lenape people are just one tribe, when technically they weren't.
That's helpful. I think, you know, that expands my understanding certainly from what I learned when I was in Indiana, because I didn't know much then, maybe knew a little bit more. Now I know slightly more. So that other question, I dropped my Q&As. This attendee is saying that his brother is trying to track down a story he read about where artifacts were looted in the 1920s from Muncie Caves in Rockland and Bergen County. And they went to the New York State Museum in search of more info this past summer. And there weren't people familiar with where the artifacts might have gone. So do you know anything about that? And what is known about these Muncie Caves?
I don't know really anything about that. I mean, I've heard, you know, through the grapevine that, you know, there were stories about people looting, but people have been looting indigenous sites for everywhere, you know, so that's sort of a, I mean, even when, I know up in Bear Mountain, there were, you know, Harriman State Park, there were also caves up there. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure about this particular thing you're talking about, but I don't doubt that it's true.
What is the Cliff? I'm sure others might want to know this too, but what is one of the kind of central messages that you would want to share with people, like the exhibit title at the National Museum, you know, we are still here? Is that the thing? I mean, because it is assumed that people were wiped out, you know?
Yeah, I think it's less, I think more Americans, because of, you know, so many TV shows and there's been so much more Native representation, that I don't think that I think that tide is changing, and people are starting to recognize that there are indigenous people still here. There's a, you know, a lot more traditions, culture, people being represented in the media, and then of course with social media. So, you know, I think that title holds true because there are plenty of people who don't know, but you know, I really think that, you know, we've made huge progress in that field, that the typical American, you know, does know that we're still here. But that, you know, that's been a slow process in happening, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we are also part of something called the Northern Slavery Collective, and for so many people, they don't realize that there was slavery in the North. They, you know, it's the idea that it was only something that happened in the South. And so geographically, we have very different understandings of history in the United States. We tend to sort of think things happened over there and not in our own backyard. And so is there a museum exhibit that you would recommend in the New York area? I know there's work being done at the Museum of the City of New York with different folks. Is there something that you would recommend?
I'm not really that familiar with the, you know, I haven't been to the National Museum of the American Indian since, I mean, I did work there for a number of years way back in the early 90s. But I haven't been there in a long time. So I really don't know what, you know, they have displayed there. I know, you know, the city is doing more and more recognition of the Lenape, so to speak, than ever before. There really was never anything. So that's good. But I don't really know what the the area museums are doing as applied to the Lenape in general. There have always been I don't know if it's still up, but the museum did have the Iroquois ironworker piece that was giving respect, paying homage to the Iroquois ironworkers who helped build the city. There still is an Iroquois community in Bay Ridge, in Brooklyn, of Iroquois ironworkers, and some of them have gotten married and still live there, in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Back in like the 70s and 60s, and in Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, there were a lot of Mohawk and Iroquois families from Canada and from upstate New York who used to reside in that area, and they were products of ironworkers. But there's not many families left there anymore.
We do have somebody who is saying that they went to the New York Historical Society exhibit on New Netherland, and that includes a letter from present-day Lenape about the purchase of Manhattan. So I guess their response, I don't know what, like who that is when we say present-day Lenape, that's complicated, but about the purchase of Manhattan. And I think that is probably one of the biggest things that has come out in the past 10 years, is just that sort of the fallacy of the purchase, shall we say.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when that comes up, Indigenous people are always quick to remind them that, they never stayed on the same piece of land for extended period of time. Villages always moved. If you depleted the soil and the game in that area, you would move on to another area and let that, aside from the facts of owning land and Indigenous perspectives on that. But, they never imagined that they were giving the Dutch that land for eternity. That wasn't really how they thought and how they lived. So, it's a completely different perspective. They might have, they were definitely trading for use of the land, but not for, permanent structures and
right. The Empire State Building.
Right. Building a wall that later on became Wall Street,
Right, right. Well, Danielle, did you have any other questions?
No, I think that kind of wraps us up for the night, unless anybody else has any buzzer beater questions to pop into the Q&A. But we'll just kind of start wrapping up by saying thank you, Cliff, for being here, spending the evening with us. Oh, it looks like we did just get one buzzer beater. Okay. Okay, so someone wanted to share some thoughts. 2 notes about Indigenous peoples in the US. In Puerto Rico, they thought that the Taino population was wiped out by the Spanish, but recent DNA testing has shown that most Puerto Ricans have Taino DNA. So they were not wiped out. Second, there is a museum near Youngstown that was being remodeled, and many of the articles in the museum were actually stolen during the past couple of years. So they just wanted to share some thoughts. I don't know if you have anything to kind of hop onto that, but
yeah, no.
Okay. So yeah, so thank you very much, Cliff.
Thank you.
For
good luck with everything you guys are doing there. If you guys need any help or assistance in programming or stuff, or coming up with some ideas, let us know. We've been doing this for a long time. We could definitely help you out. and yeah, and definitely, you know, go online. You could check out the Ramapo Lenape, and they do have information up on that and their and I think they're on their website or what have you. But they do have some land in Mahwah, New Jersey.
Thank you, Cliff. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Cliff. So just before we head out, Cliff, you can head on out. I don't want to keep you here, but just for our audience members, if you are interested, we have some upcoming events starting November 30th. We have our Holidays by Candlelight, which is a spinoff and a new program based off of our old Candlelight program, which is going to be a really fun and interesting hands-on historic immersive experience for children aimed at ages 4 through 12. So definitely check that out on our website. December 14th, 2024 is our Con Edison Family and Community Day. And then busy day on December 14th, we have our paranormal fundraiser. So if you want to continue to support the museum, or you have an interest in our paranormal programming, that is always sold out and sells out before I even blink my eyes, you can definitely check that out. It's going to be fun. There are going to be historic foods and drinks, lots of spooky, scary vibes. And yeah, we'll get to kind of like go behind the scenes of the Morris-Jumel mansion and see what happens during our paranormal investigations. And then on December 18th, we have yet another virtual parlor chat. So just this very same format. If you'd like to come on back for another one, we'll be here. Alrighty, so thank you all for attending. My name's Danielle. I'm the Public Programs and Visitor Services Manager at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. Catherine, who you heard a bit, is also the Executive Director of the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And we just want to thank you all for stopping by and being here tonight. Thank you all.
All right. Thanks, Danielle. Good night.
Good night, all.